Hey everyone, welcome to the show. Have you ever imagined like being at a fancy state dinner, but then suddenly you're surrounded by naked people?
Um, no, not really.
Right, it sounds crazy. But then picture this. You have to make a super quick escape from this weird dinner, in heels no less, and you end up running straight into a tunnel packed with horses, like totally terrified horses.
Okay, now it sounds a little more familiar. I mean, not the naked people part, but definitely those moments where you find yourself in these totally unexpected situations.
Exactly, and that feeling of just utter absurdity. Well, it's surprisingly similar to the early days of Facebook, at least according to Sarah Wynn-Williams' book, Careless People. It's kind of like a darkly comedic thriller in a way, but it's actually a real behind-the-scenes look at her 7 years working in the inner circle of Facebook.
Oh, wow. So it's a memoir.
Yeah, but it's more than just your typical tell-all. It's like this raw, honest, and often shocking account of what it was actually like to be there as this tech giant was just exploding in growth and figuring out its place in the world.
I can see why you picked this one. It sounds fascinating.
It really is. And if you're interested in these kinds of stories about ambition, the chaos of hypergrowth, and the often hidden realities behind these companies that are shaping our world, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives like this one.
Definitely. These stories, these kind of insider perspectives, they're so important for understanding how these tech giants operate.
Absolutely. Now, you actually shared this book with us, and what really struck us was how honest and candid it is. It really gives you this unique glimpse into how quickly Facebook went from this, idealistic vision of connecting the world to, well, something far more complex and messy.
Right. And it's not just about the technology, but also about the people, the decisions they made, and the impact of those decisions on a global scale.
Exactly. So for today's deep dive, we're going to unpack some of the most revealing and thought-provoking moments from the book. We're going to focus on those surprising clashes between idealism and reality, the challenges of trying to create global policy for a company growing at such an insane speed, and also, the personal journey of the author as she's trying to navigate all of this and hold on to her own sense of right and wrong.
Sounds like quite the ride.
It really is. So why don't we start at the beginning with what the book calls the hopeful comedy phase of Facebook's early days.
Yeah, I'm curious about that. What made those early days so comical, I guess?
Well, remember that state dinner I mentioned earlier, the one with the naked people and the horses?
Oh, right. That was actually from the book.
Yeah. It's in the very first chapter.
Mhm.
Wynn-Williams describes this scene where she's at this official event in Panama, and there are literally naked people just wandering around.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then there's all this awkwardness with the seating arrangements, people frantically trying to switch name cards. And then she ends up having to escape through this tunnel filled with these totally freaked out horses.
Wow. Okay, I can see the comedy part now. But what does that have to do with Facebook?
Well, she uses this anecdote to illustrate what it felt like to be a part of Facebook during those early years. It was like constantly venturing into uncharted territory, encountering these totally unexpected situations, and often having to improvise and just kind of roll with the punches.
I see. So it was like organized chaos on a global scale.
Exactly. And her initial drive to work for Facebook, it came from this very optimistic belief in its potential to connect people and do good in the world. She even describes these early attempts to convince people of this vision, like in her first interview, where she says she sounded utterly insane.
Well, it was a pretty radical idea at the time, right? Connecting the entire world through this one platform.
Oh, absolutely. But her persistence paid off. She ended up getting that first role in Australia, and then she even went further and basically created the position of manager of global public policy for herself.
That's impressive. So she was really shaping the way Facebook approached policy from the ground up.
Yeah, and it's interesting because even then there was this kind of uncertainty about whether her role was even a real job, as Marn Levine, who was a pretty high up executive at the time, questioned.
Wow, so they were really figuring things out as they went along.
Or totally. And even the physical spaces of their offices back then reflected that. Like they were working in this Washington, D.C. building with raw concrete walls and fake graffiti. It was supposed to be symbolic of disruption, but it also, kind of clashed with the whole traditional world of government and diplomacy that they were starting to interact with.
Right, I can see how that would be a bit jarring.
Oh, totally. There's this one anecdote about a visit from the New Zealand Prime Minister. Sheryl Sandberg was super focused on Facebook page usage, and finding this one specific person named Choppy online, while the prime minister's office was expecting to have, these high-level discussions about technology and innovation.
That's so awkward.
I know. It just shows how Facebook's internal priorities didn't always line up with the expectations of the outside world. And then there was that time when they had a German delegation visit their office, and the whole disruptive design actually made them think that Facebook was reckless and irresponsible.
Oh, wow. So their attempts to be different were actually backfiring.
Yeah, it was definitely a learning curve for them. And then on top of all that, there was this intense work culture at Facebook. Like, they believed that having too much on your plate was actually a good thing because it prevented trouble and territoriality.
So it was like a pressure cooker environment.
Pretty much. Yeah. But even with all that, Wynn-Williams was still really enthusiastic about Facebook's mission. She worked on those first community guidelines and transparency reports, and you can see that she genuinely believed in the power of connecting people.
It's interesting how those early ideals start to get tested as Facebook expands and encounters more of the real world.
Oh, absolutely. And that's exactly what we see happening as they start to engage more directly with governments around the world. There's this moment where Elliot Schrage, who is a top communications executive, tells her to just make sure Javi has a good time when he's visiting Colombia.
Javi, who's that?
So Javi was this really powerful figure within Facebook, but he operated kind of behind the scenes. He had this strong interest in Spanish-speaking countries, and so they sent Wynn-Williams to Colombia to basically make sure he had a good time, like a personal guide almost.
Okay, that seems a little strange.
It was. And it kind of highlights how personal relationships could sometimes influence their policy work in these unexpected ways. Like, she ends up accompanying him to this late-night salsa club, and it's just this surreal experience.
So it was all about making connections, even if it was through salsa dancing.
I guess so. But then there's this other moment where Javi tells her to don't come back until you've sorted it out in regards to Myanmar.
Myanmar. That's a pretty complex situation to just sort out.
Oh, absolutely. We're talking about a country with a long history of conflict and human rights abuses, but Javi just drops this command on her, and she's expected to figure it out.
It sounds like they were really throwing her into the deep end.
They were. She describes this trip to Nay Pyi, the capital city, where she travels along this long deserted highway and then have this very surreal meeting with Aung San Suu Kyi, who was a Nobel Peace Prize winner and a key political figure in Myanmar at the time.
I bet that was an interesting encounter.
It was, but also challenging because of the language barrier and the cultural differences. And then there's this moment where she's in this dimly lit government building, and suddenly a bright light flashes on, and she realizes she's being recorded on video.
That's a bit creepy.
It was. She even compares it to those videos released by, terrorist groups. And then the conversation shifts to, of all things, unblocking Facebook in the country.
Wow, what a contrast.
Right. It just shows how disconnected Facebook's priorities could be from the realities on the ground of these places. And these trips, they were exhausting for her, both physically and mentally.
I can imagine.
Oh, and then there's this whole thing with Sheryl Sandberg and Prime Minister Abe of Japan. Sandberg was absolutely obsessed with getting a photo of him holding her book, but the Japanese side was really resistant to it.
I remember that book. It was about women in leadership, right?
Yeah, lean in. And Wynn-Williams describes how it felt like she was smuggling illicit contraband, trying to sneak this photo opportunity in.
It sounds like they were really pushing their own agenda.
They were. But what's interesting is that despite all that focus on the photo op, they actually had some really productive policy discussions during the meeting.
So maybe it wasn't all bad.
Maybe not. But then you have this other tension playing out, which is the contrast between Facebook's public message of bring your authentic self to work and the unwritten rule that you basically never talk about your kids. Like, Sandberg herself reportedly limited her own children's screen time, but then publicly championed initiatives like Project Family, which encouraged families to use Facebook together.
That's a pretty big disconnect.
It is.
Yeah.
And it kind of shows how there was this gap between the image they were trying to project and the actual experiences of their employees, especially working mothers.
Right. And then there was that whole internet.org project, which was all about connecting the unconnected parts of the world. Mark Zuckerberg talked about using drones, satellites, lasers. It sounded incredibly ambitious.
It did. The basic strategy was to partner with governments and offer free access to a limited set of apps, including, of course, Facebook. They even went so far as to try and convince the Colombian president to sign on, and that involved traveling through a FARC stronghold, which was pretty dangerous.
Wow. They were really going all out.
They were. But then things started to get complicated. They faced a lot of pushback from companies like Google and Apple, who didn't want Facebook controlling access to the internet.
That makes sense. I mean, it's a lot of power for one company to have.
Exactly. And then there was this whole criminal investigation in Korea. They actually issued arrest warrants for Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg.
Seriously, what was that about?
It had to do with some legal issues around their operations in Korea. And it got so bad that they talked about sending someone over there as a body to basically test the waters and see how serious the situation was.
Body?
Yeah, like someone expendable, I guess. And Wynn-Williams, who was a no mom at the time, was actually considered for this role.
Oh my gosh, that's awful.
It is. And it kind of shows how this relentless pursuit of growth and their willingness to take risks was starting to overshadow their initial idealism. There's also this incident where Wynn-Williams questions why they need to fly private, and Sheryl Sandberg gets really upset about it, even though it seemed like a valid concern.
So the perks of power were becoming more important.
It seems that way. And then you have Mark Zuckerberg starting to exhibit some really strange behavior. He starts talking about how Andrew Jackson was America's greatest president and becomes fixated on getting Facebook into China after visiting Indonesia.
Those are some interesting choices.
They are. And then you have Vaughn Smith, who was tasked with getting Facebook into China. He basically says they'll do whatever it takes, including building censorship tools and ignoring human rights concerns. Wynn-Williams even compares it to the Nazis at Nuremberg, which is pretty chilling.
Wow, so they were willing to compromise their values to get into China.
It seems so. And then another big shift happens when Marn Levine is replaced by Joel Kaplan, and the company's focus shifts toward U.S. Republican politics. Kaplan tries to establish PACs outside the U.S., but is shocked to learn that it's illegal and could be considered bribery.
So they're playing fast and loose with the rules, both domestically and internationally.
It seems that way. And then Mark Zuckerberg starts making content decisions himself, overriding the established community guidelines based on whether he thinks it'll get Facebook blocked in a country or get one of their employees arrested.
That's a lot of power for one person to have.
It is. And it shows how he was increasingly calling the shots and making decisions that could have huge implications. There's also this moment where Wynn-Williams is in Davos with Kenny Jacobs, another executive, and they openly discuss tax avoidance strategies in Ireland.
So they're not just pushing ethical boundaries, they're also trying to skirt financial regulations.
Yeah, it paints a pretty unflattering picture. And amidst all of this, you have Wynn-Williams trying to balance her incredibly demanding job with being a new mom. She even describes having to sing happy birthday to her baby over a crackly hotel room phone in Davos because she couldn't be there in person.
It sounds like a really difficult situation to be in.
It was. And then the rollout of Internet.org gets delayed, and Mark Zuckerberg becomes even more personally invested in it. He even attends the Summit of the Americas, where he goes on this chaotic belusukan with the Indonesian president-elect, which is basically like a spontaneous walkabout through the streets.
I remember seeing those pictures.
Right. And Zuckerberg's reaction to the whole thing seems really out of touch. He doesn't seem to understand why the local people aren't more enthusiastic about him and Facebook.
That's kind of tone deaf, considering all the issues they were already facing.
It is. And then on the flight back from the summit, they have this crazy, drunken karaoke session on the private jet.
So it's like a constant party atmosphere mixed with these high-stakes decisions.
Yeah, it's a strange combination. And after the 2016 U.S. election, Zuckerberg becomes convinced that Facebook played a key role in Trump's victory, and even starts thinking about running for president himself.
Wow, talk about a power trip.
Right. And then he gets embroiled in this controversy over buying up land in Hawaii, and there's this new stock structure created that allows him to leave Facebook to serve in government without losing control of the company.
So it's really setting himself up for a potential political career.
It seems that way. And at the same time, there's this growing discontent within Facebook. This group called the Feminist Fight Club emerges. And there are a lot of concerns about the treatment of women and minorities in the company.
It sounds like a lot of internal turmoil was brewing.
It was. And then you have this truly horrific situation in Myanmar where Facebook's platform is used to spread hate speech against the Rohingya Muslim minority.
I remember reading about that. It was a really tragic situation.
It was. And Facebook was incredibly slow to respond. They seemed more concerned with protecting their growth than with preventing the spread of violence and hate speech.
That's just awful.
It is. And then Joel Kaplan, the same guy who was trying to set up illegal panels, reportedly behaves inappropriately at a company off-site, but nothing is done about it. It shows a real lack of accountability at the top.
So the company culture seems to be deteriorating as well.
Yeah. And Wynn-Williams starts to get really disillusioned. She stops fully supporting initiatives she disagrees with, and things really come to a head when she's asked to lead the China policy team.
But she was against getting into China. Right.
Exactly. She knew it would mean compromising their values and potentially aiding in censorship and surveillance, but she's basically forced to take the role. And she learns that Facebook is planning to collaborate with the Chinese government on these very things.
That's a huge betrayal of their supposed principles.
It is. And during congressional hearings about their activities in China, they're coached to be evasive and misleading. They even block the page of Guo Wengui, a Chinese dissident, at the request of the Chinese government.
So they're actively silencing dissent to appease an authoritarian regime.
It seems so. And then they launch unauthorized Facebook apps in China without even telling their own employees.
Wow, they're really going behind everyone's backs at this point.
They are. And then you have this junior researcher in Australia who gets fired for doing work that was probably directed by her superiors, and several fact-checking partners resign because they feel like Facebook isn't serious about fighting misinformation.
It's like they've completely abandoned any pretense of ethical behavior.
It seems that way. And then there's this final chilling anecdote about a contractor who has a seizure on the office floor and is basically ignored by everyone around him.
That's just heartbreaking.
It is. And it really underscores how this relentless pursuit of growth and power had eroded any sense of human decency within the company.
So what happens in the end? Does anything change?
Well, the epilogue tells us that Joel Kaplan is still a powerful figure at Meta, Facebook's parent company, and that he publicly supported Brett Kavanaugh during his Supreme Court confirmation hearings.
That's not very encouraging.
It's not. And it shows how difficult it is to hold these companies accountable, even when there's clear evidence of wrongdoing.
So what's the takeaway from all of this?
I think it's a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the importance of holding powerful companies accountable for their actions.
Definitely. And it makes you wonder, what responsibility do these companies have to society? And as users, what can we do to protect ourselves from these often hidden forces that are shaping our online experiences?
Exactly. So to everyone listening, what were your biggest takeaways from this deep dive? What moments resonated with you the most? Let's keep this conversation going in the comments. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.